Dr. Brendan Egan is with us now from DCU Health and Human Performance to talk about a new study on the impact of time-restricted eating and what impact this can have on your health and sports performance. Brendan, good morning to you. How are you?
Morning, Joe.
What is time-restricted eating?
Oh, good place to start. Well, it's, and generally people will, when they wake up in the morning to when they finish eating at the end of the day, it's often between 14 and 16 hours. So time-restricted eating is just a model where we try and condense that eating window. So usually it can be done by either skipping breakfast or by not snacking late at night. And so generally, and in the case that we did, it was an 8-hour window of eating. So 16 hours of fasting per day and 8 hours of eating. And so it's a time-restricted eating window, and that's where the name comes from.
Every Irish mammy in the world is rolling over, shouting at the radio, Brendan, skipping breakfast. What are you doing to the nation?
Yeah. Well, it's not actually skipping breakfast, you're just delaying breakfast. I think that's the point that we like to make. But the idea is that obviously it doesn't substitute for changing in dietary patterns. There's still the basic principles that everyone should be adhering to in terms of good diet. The idea with time-restricted eating is, from a health point of view, is that there's some benefits shown around the control of blood sugars, for example. And for people who are trying to lose weight, sometimes it can be a more, let's call it, effortless way of losing weight, because there's not necessarily any counting of calories involved. It's just simply a restriction in that eating window, like I said. And the knock-on effect often is that people eat less because they eat for shorter periods of time during the day. So there's a myriad of benefits that come with that.
Okay, so to dumb it down for me here, you're not actually telling me I need to eat less. I just need to eat in a shorter window.
Well, that's the approach that we took in our study, yes. We were dealing with endurance athletes who, would have had a fairly regimented lifestyle already in terms of the way they trained and the way they ate. And we simply asked them to eat for only 8 hours a day. And it was up to them which way they wanted to do it. Now, most people, just for social reasons, they will skip breakfast because they want to be able to eat later into the day. And so more often than not, time-restricted eating, people tend to practice it as, starting their day, having their breakfast at noon and finishing their eating at 8 p.m. But it can be done in other ways. You can stop eating late in the evening, which for a lot of people means cutting out treats, cutting out junk food, cutting out alcohol. So, depending on whether you do a so-called early or late time restricted eating, there can be different effects.
Okay, let me just get into some of the details here. So the study is the first of its kind to investigate the effect of a period of intermittent fasting, as we've been talking about, in the form of the popular method of 16-8. So 16 hours fasting, 8 hours eating in an endurance-trained population. So these are people who actually aren't Joe Public, but it does have, for Joe and Josephine Public, fairly significant implications that we could all benefit from. The approach has become popular in the general population in recent years, but in athletic populations had only previously been studied in strength training individuals, and mixed effects have been reported. So what did you find in the people who you were talking about here, Brendan, who are actually endurance athletes and who already had that impulse to train? Did it have an impact on them?
Yeah, so we had two main outcomes in the study. One is looking at performance measures or indications of performance. So, endurance athletes are interested in their lactate threshold and the running speed at which that occurs at, and they're also interested in their maximum aerobic capacity, or VO2 max as it's called. And so from that point of view, those markers did not change over the course of the 8 weeks that they were consuming or following the time-restricted eating pattern. But what we did see was a reduction in body weight, which is interesting on two fronts, because like we talked about, they weren't told to eat anything different, just to eat whatever they wanted, but within a narrower window. And that ultimately meant that they consumed actually a little less carbohydrate and overall less calories. And that is, why they lost on average about 1 kilo over the course of the 8 weeks. But because they're already endurance athletes, they're already well trained, that's a fairly decent amount of weight loss in a short period of time. So the knock-on effect potentially, again, depends on the time of the year and how you're using this tool in the toolbox, so to speak. But that type of a small amount of weight loss, at the right time of year could be beneficial to performance.
Which end of the candle is worse to burn, Brendan? Is it the eating late at night, or is it breaking the fast early in the morning?
I would say that's not, scientifically not established, but pragmatically speaking, I think when I look at food diaries of athletes and the general population that I come across, an awful lot of it does seem to be calories shifted towards the end of the day. So, people, if I'm thinking of people in my generation, the kids are in bed and the next thing it's, celebrate with a bar of chocolate and then maybe a glass of wine. And, the calories do begin to stack up pretty much at that point.
Are you spying on me? Is that what's going on here? Is that I feel shots fired.
So I think that's an obvious, say, pragmatic way of looking at it, is that if you cut down the kind of bad habits late in the day, that's an obvious benefit. But there are, independent of that, there are some studies now that look at the difference between that early time restricted eating, where basically you don't eat in the evening, versus late time restricted eating, where you skip breakfast. So the window is kept the same, and weight loss doesn't. Weight loss is the same, and ultimately there still is that benefit to having less calories and less food and so on in the evening time. So I think there is probably, that's the direction people are going to go. But socially speaking, an awful lot of us are doing training in the evening. We're meeting up with friends in the afternoon and the evening. It doesn't often work to be trying to not eat anything that late in the day.
No, for sure. And I'd assume it'll be much easier for people to actually do this in the morning time as well. Like just a few very small practical things then. If you are doing time restricted eating and you're not supposed to eat until lunchtime, are you allowed to have a cup of coffee in the morning?
Yeah, well, this again is a kind of question about practical things. So, if you're calling it purely speaking a fast, then as soon as you consume anything that contains a calorie, then it's not a fast. But again, to be practical about it, if a cup of coffee means that you adhere to it, let's say the coffee quenches your appetite, for example, you find it easier to get to breakfast without, to noon, let's say, without consuming food, then that's the ends justifying the means, in my opinion. So again, it's a difference between an Americano and a Frappuccino, in terms of the amount of nutrients that are going to be there. So, if you're having a very sugary, high-fat type of coffee, then I think you may be defeating the purpose. But teas and coffees, where they're containing very little calories in terms of additive ingredients, I think they're fine in the context of intermittent fasting.
So if you wake up and have a cup of black tea, a cup of black coffee, and don't have anything until 11 o'clock, you can eat your normal stuff from 11 to 7, and then and over the course of 8 weeks, elite athletes have shown that they're able to lose a full kilo. Already, these are people who are living a fairly Spartan lifestyle, so that's fairly significant. Yeah. Does that have a knock-on impact automatically on performance?
I would say it's indirect. It depends on whether there's a need to lose weight. So, for example, this would be a tool that you might use in a pre-season block where someone's trying to lose weight. Remember, in our study, we didn't actually ask them to lose weight. So this was what we'd call spontaneous weight loss. And again, with endurance athletes, you could argue that might be a bad thing as well, because it meant that their energy availability was low. In other words, they weren't consuming enough calories for their training. Then that could be a negative effect. But in the context of, let's say you had a group of team sport players, games players, and they were in a pre-season block, and you wanted to drop some weight in addition to getting that bit fitter, intermittent fasting of this manner would probably be something that could be beneficial. So that's probably the next place that our research will go.
And I guess from the general public's perspective, a lot of people are constantly on diets, and there's all sorts of nonsense out there in the field. This seems fairly straightforward. Like, it's not a very difficult thing for most people to do with a little bit of organisation, and it could have fairly immediate impact.
Yeah, that's why there has been such an explosion of interest in intermittent fasting over the last, say, 5 to 10 years. So initially there was a lot of promising research coming out of preclinical rodent studies and so on. And then as this began to move into the clinic in terms of obesity and type 2 diabetes, and more now into general population, there's this repeated observation of improvements in health when people undertake this type of regimen. And like I say, you can have variations in terms of you could adjust other aspects of diet, but simply the instruction of just narrowing your eating window is a fairly easy thing for a lot of people to do. And there's kind of defined endpoints of that window. So again, it makes it a little bit easier for people to see, well, I start here and I end here, and there's no gray area, so to speak. And so, yeah, from a public health point of view, that's why there has been this interest in it. But, my fear is that sometimes you have a situation where things show a benefit, and then people take it to the nth degree, which is, well, I can eat whatever rubbish I want as long as I don't eat outside the window. That's what you don't want to start happening.
That's what I heard. That's definitely what I heard. The clock goes 10 to 7, right? Stuff you're saying, face for the next 10 minutes. Yeah. And obviously you did a study with 23 middle and long distance endurance athletes. Is this something that you might consider rolling out to the general public to see what the impact is?
Yeah, well, those studies have been done in other countries, and again, the evidence on the whole is fairly positive. Our next interest is probably going to keep this in athletes and try and extend it out to a bigger population. And like I said, Gaelic Games players in pre-season is the study that we want to do. So we just need to get a Gaelic season to start and get those people recruited, and maybe we can make it happen.
And then the last thing, obviously, you make the point pre-season and very specific about that, because if you were playing games midweek, you probably don't want to be in the middle of fasting. You want to kind of have nutrition specifically based for high performance midweek under lights, if that is your particular sports request.
Yeah, and again, this is why we say, you know, the context is important, because, you know, if someone is training late at night, let's say you have a very intense training session that ends at 9:30, as is common with a lot of recreation athletes and games players, you know, the next morning, what would typically be breakfast at say 8 a.m. or so, that's still in the so-called recovery window. So restricting food intake at that point, considering you might have another training session that evening or a game within the next 24 hours, you know, that probably isn't good practice from a nutrition point of view. So it does need to be applied in the right manner, you know, depending on the context.
Okay, good stuff. Well, keep up the good work. And if anybody wants any more information, what's the easiest way to find it?
Well, there's a release on the DCU website, so you can Google intermittent fasting and endurance athletes, you'll probably find it. Or my address is, you know, easy enough found, brendan.egan@dcu.ie.
Brendan, good stuff. Thanks a million for joining this morning. That was really interesting. Cheers. Dr. Brendan Egan there giving us some details on that. It's 11 minutes past 9.